Thanks, everyone, for staying around. I'm going to read a story, and this is the first time I've read this one. And I was telling Rebecca Cook, one of my friends, that the characters sing a lot in this story, and I'm an awful singer. And if I started to sing the lyrics, it'd be like dogs howling. And Rebecca has a beautiful voice, and I was thinking it would have been nice if I'd practiced beforehand and just handed her the singing parts and let him sing them, but didn't think that far ahead. This is one of my stories that takes place in Korea. I think a lot of you guys know I lived there for 12 years, and sometimes I write about that. And the story takes place in Seoul, and the title is called Women Who Smoke. I was at this bar with Neal trying to remember songs. He sat across from me, just like Steve had. Outside, the street was gradually darkening. I stared at a blank square of paper on the table and brought the tip of the pen to my lips, hoping that something would come to me. The last time I'd been here was 6 months ago. Steve and I had been sitting in the same booth with the same window that looked out at the same man tending the fire. That was when I told him I knew about the Korean girl. What was her name, I asked him. Stephen said it didn't matter, her name, that it was a mistake, that we never should have moved here together. He never should have invited me. And I said, who do you think you are, the fucking president of the country? I don't need your invitation. I can live wherever the fuck I want. I can go back to Atlanta or move to LA or New Orleans. But guess what, I told him, I'm not going to make your life that easy. I'm not going anywhere. And then I poured a mug full of beer from our pitcher and drank it real slow, just to prove it. Now I took a drink of beer for inspiration. I wrote down The Logical Song by Supertramp, Barry Manilow, Copacabana, Olivia Newton-John, Have You Never Been Mellow? Where do you come up with those? Neal lit a cigarette, abandoning his own blank slip of paper. He was British and didn't get the sad beauty of those songs. Steve, I said, he was good with that stuff. I closed my eyes to remember. Then I wrote down a few more songs and creased the paper in half. No more Steve, remember? Neal blew smoke at the window, even though it was closed. You asked, I said. I scooted out of the bench and walked across the bar to give the bartender my requests. Behind him, 3 shelves of albums were stacked like books, old faded things with fraying spines. I tried to make contact with the bartender, but he acted busy with the computer. I reached over the counter and put the list in front of him. He smoothed it on the counter and nodded. Back at our table, Neal had refilled my glass. You Brits are so well-mannered, I said. I batted my eyes at him and turned up the dial on my Southern accent. And all you Southern girls are so charming. He offered me a cigarette, but I shook my head. Too early. Except for the bartender, the only other people were 2 young women at the table behind Neal. Under the bar's dim lights, their hair looked like velvet. The girl whose back was to me wore a fitted turtleneck and butterfly clips in her hair, while the other had bangs cut straight across and fistfuls of bracelets on her bare arms. In between sips from their bottled beers, the girls chatted rapidly. Their cell phones were displayed on the wooden table, and every few minutes they pounced on the phones to scrutinize new text messages. Between the cell phones was a white pack of cigarettes decorated with pink butterflies. The 2 girls inhaled the ultra-slim cigarettes at the same time and occasionally waved them dramatically in the air when they wanted to emphasize a point. They reminded me of the girl Steve had left me for. Such posers, I said, acting like they're Audrey Hepburn in Breakfast at Tiffany's. Neal didn't bother turning around. When I first got here, I saw a man slap a woman for smoking in the street, he said. Why, I asked, although I thought I knew the answer. Ugly. That's what my mom called women who smoked. Ugly. Neal tapped his cigarette in the ashtray. Women weren't supposed to smoke in public. Remember you told me about Zen masters, I said? How they would strike people meditating with a stick to help them become enlightened? Maybe that's what he was doing. Neal smiled a sexy half-smile. Maybe. Riders on the Storm was playing. This place is brilliant, he said. Why didn't you show it to me before? You mean like in the whole month we've been together? Neal shrugged and sang along with Jim Morrison. I looked out the steam window onto the street. People were coming into the restaurant below, their scarves wrapped around their necks, arms hanging on each other. I felt a pang of hunger and picked a few of the squid-flavored chips out of the basket. The other thing that drives me crazy is the bathroom, I said, after I'd chewed my squid ring. They have this little metal ledge above the roll of toilet paper and a wet folded tissue for women to put their cigarettes out in. I mean, they encourage it, smoking in the toilet, just to keep the image of the pure Korean girl. What a joke. After a few drinks, they're running back to the bathroom to sneak a smoke. Pisses me off because I usually have to go really bad, and these women are taking their time puffing away in the stall, just so they can pretend to be innocent. You'll see an end to it soon enough, Neal said. You Americans started this whole non-smoking farce. That's just the beginning, I said. In Seattle, we have strip clubs where you can't drink. And no trans fat for your chips in New York, Neal said. Pardon, French fries. Taters, I said. Damn Southerner. Fucking Brit. I grabbed his hand and smiled stupidly at him. The doors had ended, and Neil Young's Expecting to Fly scratched from the LP player. The song was warped and faded. In other words, perfect. 4 Western guys walked in, taking a table near the skinny cigarette girls, but away from the windows. They wore baseball caps that hid most of their buzz cuts, pressed shirts and jeans with bright running shoes. U.S. military, enlisted. This bar was about 30 minutes away from the closest military base, making it easier to dodge the military's tight curfew, midnight curfew. And here, in a bar like this, they could meet pretty girls. Do you know that Alaska has the highest ratio of men to women in the States, I said. Women there have their pick. I tucked a strand of hair behind my ears, which were large from my face and stuck out. I kept my hair long to hide them, but sometimes I forgot or didn't care, and I'd exposed my elephant ears to the world. They sell T-shirts in Anchorage that say, "Baby, when you leave here, you'll be ugly again." I paused, waiting until Neal smirked to show he got the joke. If it weren't so damn cold there, I'd go to Alaska someday, just to see what it feels like to be those military guys at that table, I said. Who cares about them anyway? Neal closed his eyes. He was handsome in that slightly pale British thespian way. They're just generating negative energy, and if you think about them, you'll do the same. Sounds like more of that Buddhist stuff, I said. Neal opened his eyes and straightened his back so that he suddenly seemed much taller. As a matter of fact, yes, it's really helping me. How's that? I leaned toward him, hoping that he would meet me across the table and kiss me. Well, I'm learning to detach from daily annoyances, he said. I'm learning that violence does not solve problems. I'm learning that your irrational, emotional outbursts have nothing to do with me. He pronounced the words clearly and distinctly, like he was reading a diagnosis from a textbook. I traced the edge of the ashtray with my index finger. Still too early in the evening to throw it at him. Well, excuse me for feeling, I said. I slid out of the bench and stomped to the bathroom. On the way, I stopped by the bar and scribbled a hasty request and slipped in a folded 5,000 won note with it just to make sure that it was played. The women's bathroom opened to a bare sink and a single stall door, which was locked. A thin wisp of smoke trailed up to the ceiling above the stall. The toilet flushed and the turtleneck girl emerged. She was wearing tight black pencil pants and spiky heels. She ignored me as she left the room, not even washing her hands. In the stall, a lipstick-ringed cigarette butt in the metal tray glowed its dying embers. Next to the toilet, the trash can was empty, except for a few wadded tissues. By the end of the night, it would be overflowing. Toilet paper clogged the ancient city pipes, so it was forbidden to flush it. While I peed, I perused the graffiti and found my contribution. Jasmine and Steve, TLA, scrawled in the middle of a big heart. I took out the pen in my pocket and tried to scribble over Steve's name, but the tip wouldn't write on the concrete wall, so I spat on it. When I emerged from the bathroom, the turtleneck girl and her friend had transported their cell phones, cigarettes, and bottled beers to the table with the military guys. I sat back down and refused to look at Neal, who was singing, "And So Sally Can Wait. She Knows It's Too Late," as we're walking by, Her soul slides away, but don't look it back in anger. Oasis, his request, no doubt. Outside, the city was too bright for stars. On the street below, people were walking arm in arm, bundled in groups of threes and fours, steaming the air with their laughter. A man on the side of the street was busy bringing the large hot coals from the fire he'd been tending into the bulgogi restaurant. Finally, I faced Neal. "See that girl with the bangs and bracelets?" I asked. Neal twisted his head. "Don't be too obvious. They were sitting behind us, but they're with those military guys now." "And? I think that's the girl Steve left me for," I said. "So?" "Well, it pisses me off." "Maybe it's not her," he said. "It is." But I wasn't sure. I'd only seen Steve with the girl once, when I'd stumbled upon them one night at another bar down the street from this one. I'd seen bangs, though, and bracelets before I ran out. I drained my beer, thinking that there never seemed to be enough in my glass. My request came on then, the one I'd slipped the bill for. "Both sides now," I sang, "It's love's illusions I recall. I really don't know love at all." Neal just shook his head, wrote something on a piece of paper, and went up to the bar. He sat back down across from me, his eyes narrowed. When his song came on, he gave a satisfied smile. "American woman, stay away from me. American woman, mama, let me be," he bellowed out of key. I laughed and joined in, singing even louder than him. When the song was over, I moved to Neal's side of the table and kissed his neck. He filled my glass, leaving an inch of foam at the top. I felt his knee rub mine, and I wanted to go back to his place and have sex right then. The bar was getting more crowded. A few tables of Koreans, college-age, thin, with glasses, were air guitaring to Bon Jovi. The girls with them were dressed up in heels and held tiny purses in the crook of their arms. They looked like they'd much rather be somewhere not so dark and dingy, a place that served colored cocktails. They were biding their time. All the tables were full now, which meant the time for me and my song requests were over. We were having territory problems. Cigarettes were borrowed. Neal's lighter was appropriated. Beers were poured, empty glasses abandoned. More and more people were hovering over our table. Prime real estate. Love Shack was on, and the small clearing that passed for the dance floor was packed with revelers grinding under the newly installed strobe lights. The two girls had disappeared, and the Westerners' table had been taken over by a group of Korean salarymen, their ties loosened, their drinking furious. 4 girls sat where the original 2 had, behind Neal. I danced near them so I could watch them. They were scheming. After the song was over, I scooted in next to Neal and waited. One of the military guys I recognized from earlier, dark-skinned, Hispanic probably, shoulders twice the width of Neal's, sat himself and his beer down across from us and ground a cigarette out in our ashtray. "Excuse me, this seat is taken," Neal said. "I don't see anyone here," the guy said. "This is our table. Someone is sitting here." "Who?" The man turned around dramatically and surveyed the bar. While he wasn't licking, Neal flicked the ash of his cigarette into the guy's beer. "I don't see anyone sitting in this chair except me," the man said. "He's in the loo." Neal blew smoke in the guy's direction. "You're a very rude guy." The military man shook his head and took a long swig of his beer. He smiled at me, all fake polite. "What about you? Do you mind if I sit here?" The man's ears looked like they belonged to an elf. "Why are you here?" I asked. "It's 12:30, past military curfew." He looked around, shrugged. "What's your name?" I asked him. "I'm Ron, from New Mexico." There's nothing there. "Well, Ron from New Mexico, how can you justify those wars?" I leaned forward and touched the gold cross he wore on a chain around his neck. "How, Ron, how?" Ron's smile disappeared. He looked at the table. "I'm not a bad guy," he said. Then he stood and left. "Well done," Neal said, giving my thigh a squeeze. It wasn't over, though. I watched Ron watching me from the other end of the bar. He towered over the Koreans. He lit a cigarette with a Zippo, then began chatting with some nearby girls. Neal's back was to me, as he was busy lighting the slim, delicate cigarettes of the girls behind us. He spoke to them in semi-fluent Korean. The bar had long stopped playing our songs. I had to go to the bathroom again. I held on to the table for support as I stood. Neal didn't even see me go. The bathroom door was locked. I signed and leaned against the wall. The door in the men's bathroom was open slightly, and no one was waiting, so I walked in. Ron from New Mexico was zipping his pants at the urinal. I backed away slowly into the hall. When he came out, he brushed my shoulder. "Can I have a cigarette?" I asked. Wordlessly, he tapped out one of his Marlboro Reds and placed it between my lips. Then he lit it with his Zippo. The girls' bathroom door was open now. Once inside, I locked the stall door and peed, tossed my used toilet paper into the now overflowing trash can. After I flushed, I stayed in the stall and smoked next to the tiny window that looked out into the alley. The ashtray was stuffed with half-smoked cigarettes, so I flushed my butt down the toilet. When I came out, Ron was still there. I fell into him. He smelled like one of the boys in my high school I dated a long time ago. "So," I whispered into his ear, "how dangerous is North Korea, really?" He had his hand on the back of my neck so that his lips grazed my earlobe. "I don't know. I just do what they tell me. I'm not a bad guy, really." "Me neither. Not really," I said. We were kissing then, the Marlboro Red fresh on my tongue and the scruff of his military haircut rough on my cheek. Then there was a hand on my shoulder pulling us apart. Neal's eyes looked red and tired. His free hand gripped his half-full mug of beer. He dropped his hand from my shoulder, shook his head, and turned away. Then he spun around and tossed his beer on the military guy's chest. I grabbed for Neal, but my hands came up with air. Before I ran out the bar, I bummed another Marlboro Red from Ron. After he lit it, he told me to disappear. It was that time of night. Halfway down the stairs, I slipped and tumbled to the bottom. People on the street, drunk themselves, stepped over me, delicately. The fireman walked past, carrying hot coals in his tongs for the groups of people in the restaurant. I stood up, shaking, and brought the cigarette, miraculously still lit, and in my hand to my lips. Neal appeared from around the corner then, his body coiled tight. He walked straight up to me and slapped me, knocking my cigarette out of my mouth into a puddle on the street. And even though I knew Neal was gone for good, I called his name as he disappeared into the drunken crowds, then Ron's name, then Steve's, then all the names I could remember, one after the other, words from a song I still didn't know. Thank you.